The year is 1879. It's past midnight in a small lab in New Jersey, and a man who was once kicked out of school for being too difficult is holding a glowing glass bulb in his hands. The filament inside has been burning for over 13 hours straight. He doesn't cheer, he doesn't call anyone, he doesn't even smile. He just watches it burn, like he already knew it would. That silence, in that dark room, on that October night, is the moment the modern world was born. And almost nobody knows the full story of the man who caused it. You've heard his name 1,000 times. But what you probably haven't heard is this. The boy who invented the future could barely hear anything at all. That he built his first laboratory at age 10 in his parents' basement, got fired from nearly every job he ever had, and turned each failure into fuel. That he didn't just invent the light bulb, he invented the idea that invention itself could be a business. That he wired the first city block in history to run on electricity, then spent years waging one of the dirtiest wars in the history of science to keep his empire alive. And that the man he went to war against, he had hired him himself, Thomas Alva Edison. 1. Those 93 patents. The phonograph, the motion picture, the electric grid, and a rivalry with Nikola Tesla so brutal, so personal, and so consequential that the world we live in today was literally built on its ashes. This is not a story about a light bulb. This is a story about obsession, about what it costs to change the world and what it costs the man who tries. Milan, Ohio, February 11, 1847. A small brick house on a hill above a canal town. Thomas Alva Edison enters the world as the seventh and last child of Samuel and Nancy Edison. Nobody in that town had any reason to think this baby would amount to anything unusual. His father was a Canadian political exile who had fled across the border after backing the losing side of a rebellion. His mother was a former school teacher who was already exhausted from raising 6 other children. But Nancy Edison saw something in her youngest son that nobody else did, especially not his teachers. When Thomas was 7, the family moved to Port Huron, Michigan. He started school, and within weeks, the trouble began. He couldn't sit still. He asked too many questions. He stared out the window. His teacher, frustrated and out of patience, called the boy addled, a word that in those days meant mentally confused, maybe even broken. Thomas heard it. He went home crying and told his mother what the teacher had said. That was the last day Thomas Edison ever spent inside a classroom. Nancy pulled him out of school that same week and began teaching him at home. She didn't treat him as a problem to be managed. She handed him science books. She encouraged him to experiment. She gave him space to be curious without apology. Edison would later say, in his own words, "My mother was the making of me. She was so true, so sure of me. And I felt I had someone to live for, someone I must not disappoint." By age 10, he had set up his first chemistry laboratory in the family basement. His father thought the strange smells and occasional small explosions were a catastrophe waiting to happen. His mother thought they were a sign. Around the same time, life was quietly taking something from him. A combination of scarlet fever in early childhood and recurring ear infections had been slowly eroding his hearing. By the time he was 12, Thomas Edison was almost completely deaf in one ear and barely hearing in the other. For most children, that would have been devastating. For Edison, it became something unexpected, a kind of advantage. In a world full of noise and distraction, he discovered he could concentrate with unusual intensity. Later in life, he would say his deafness allowed him to think without interruption. He even listened to music by biting down on the wood of a piano to feel the vibrations travel through his skull. The world had taken something from him. He turned it into a tool. But there's something nobody tells you about this chapter of Edison's life. By the time he was ready to leave that basement and face the world, his mother, the one person who had believed in him when everyone else gave up, was already gone. Nancy Edison died in 1871 when Thomas was just 24 years old. She would never see a single one of her son's great inventions. She never knew what she had created. He had to carry that forward alone. In 1859, at 12 years old, Thomas Edison took a job selling newspapers and candy on the Grand Trunk Railway, the line that ran between Port Huron and Detroit. He wasn't just selling. In the baggage car of the train, he set up a small chemistry lab and started printing his own newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, the first newspaper ever published on a moving train. The kid was never just doing one thing, he was always doing three. Then one afternoon on the railway, something happened that would reshape the rest of his life. A 3-year-old boy wandered onto the tracks with a freight car rolling toward him. Edison, without hesitating, jumped from the platform, grabbed the child, and pulled him to safety. The boy's father was a station telegraph operator named J.U. Mackenzie. He had no money to repay the teenager who had saved his son's life. But he had something better. He offered to teach Edison telegraphy, the cutting-edge communication technology of the era. Edison accepted, and he took to it immediately. For the next several years, he drifted across the American Midwest as a wandering telegraph operator. Cincinnati, Louisville, Nashville, Indianapolis, picking up work wherever he could find it, sleeping in offices, reading everything he could get his hands on about electricity and mechanics. He was restless, broke, and completely self-directed. He got hired, he got fired. He tinkered with the equipment instead of focusing on the job. Every boss he had thought he was a liability. They were all wrong. By 1869, at 22 years old, Edison arrived in New York City with almost nothing. He was wearing worn-out clothes, hadn't eaten in days, and knew virtually no one. He wandered into the offices of the Golden Stock Telegraph Company, one of the most important financial data firms in the city, just as their stock ticker broke down. While the employees panicked, Edison calmly looked at the machine, found the problem, and fixed it on the spot. The company's owner was so impressed, he hired Edison immediately and asked him to improve the machine. Edison did exactly that. The result was what he called the Universal Stock Printer, a vastly improved version of the stock ticker that synchronized transactions across multiple machines simultaneously. The Golden Stock Telegraph Company was stunned. They asked Edison how much he wanted for the rights. He had planned to ask for $2,000, but instead he paused and said, "Suppose you make me an offer." They offered $40,000. Edison later said he was so shocked he had to ask them to repeat it. He took the money, quit his day job forever, and never looked back. He was 23 years old. From that moment on, Thomas Edison had one occupation and one occupation only: inventor. And he was about to build a machine that would make that occupation something the world had never seen before. With $40,000 and a clear vision, Edison moved to the New Jersey countryside and began constructing something entirely new. In 1876, he opened a laboratory complex in the small village of Menlo Park, a cluster of buildings that included a machine shop, a library, a chemistry lab, and offices all under one roof. He nicknamed it the Invention Factory. Nothing like it had ever existed. Before Menlo Park, inventors worked alone in isolation, scratching out ideas in private. Edison assembled a team: machinists, chemists, mathematicians, engineers, people he called his muckers. They worked together, argued together, failed together, and occasionally slept on lab benches together. Edison himself often worked 20 hours straight. He survived on cat naps, cheap cigars, and a near-obsessive need to solve whatever problem was in front of him. The goal he set for his team was audacious to the point of absurdity: a minor invention every 10 days and a major invention every 6 months. He wasn't joking. The first invention to stop the world in its tracks came in 1877. Edison had been working on improvements to the telephone, experimenting with ways to record telegraph messages mechanically. One evening, following a chain of intuitions he could barely explain, he sketched a crude device, a cylinder wrapped in tin foil with 2 needles attached to diaphragms. He handed the sketch to his machinist, John Crucy, and told him to build it. Crucy reportedly thought the whole thing was nonsense, but he built it in about 30 hours. Edison set the finished device on a bench, leaned forward, and spoke the words. Mary had a little lamb. He rewound the cylinder and played it back. The machine spoke his words back to him. Crucy went pale. Edison later wrote that he was more astonished than anyone in the room. He had not actually expected it to work on the first attempt. The phonograph, the first machine in human history capable of recording and replaying sound, had been born almost by accident on a December night in a New Jersey lab. Edison took the device to the offices of Scientific American magazine. According to their own account, he placed it on a desk, turned a crank, and the machine greeted the staff, asked how they liked the phonograph, and wished them a good night. The staff were stunned. Word spread instantly. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories. Crowds gathered outside Menlo Park, just hoping to catch a glimpse of the man they were now calling the Wizard of Menlo Park. Edison had become the most famous inventor in the world, but he already knew his next challenge, and it was going to be the hardest thing he had ever attempted. He had 14 months to do what hundreds of inventors before him had tried and failed. He was going to light the world. The problem with the light bulb wasn't the concept. Dozens of inventors across Europe and America had already created incandescent lamps that glowed. The problem was that none of them lasted. They burned out in minutes, required enormous amounts of current, and were completely impractical for everyday use. Everyone in the scientific community had essentially accepted this as a limitation that couldn't be overcome. The gas industry was thriving and felt unthreatened. Edison didn't accept the limitation. He just started testing. Over 14 months between 1878 and 1879, Edison and his team at Menlo Park ran more than 1,000 experiments with different filament materials: platinum, carbonized paper, various types of wood, horsehair, fishing line, cotton thread. Each one failed. Each failure was logged, analyzed, and used to guide the next attempt. Edison famously described this process not as failure, but as successfully discovering what didn't work. Then he tried bamboo, a carbonized strip of bamboo sealed inside a glass bulb with the air pumped out, burned for over 13 hours on the night of October 24th, 1879. Edison kept the team awake through the night watching it. When it finally went out the following afternoon, having lasted longer than any filament before it, he knew he had the answer. But here's what the textbooks usually leave out. Edison didn't just want a light bulb. He wanted a complete system. He invented safety fuses, on and off switches for individual sockets, an efficient generator, insulated copper wire, and the junction boxes needed to distribute current across a neighborhood. He designed the entire infrastructure from the ground up because he understood that a light bulb without a power source was useless to the average person. On September 4th, 1882, Edison threw the switch on Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, the world's first commercial electric power plant. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with 6 massive generators humming and a network of underground copper wire snaking beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan, the lights came on. Within a month, 59 customers had signed up. Within a year, there were 500. Within a decade, the model had been replicated in cities across America and Europe. That afternoon in Manhattan didn't just light a few offices. It launched the electrical age. Every power grid on Earth today is a direct descendant of what Edison built on Pearl Street. He was 35 years old. He was the most famous man in America. He had backers including J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilt family. He had built what was, at that moment, the most consequential technology company in the world. And then a young Serbian engineer walked through his door, and everything started to unravel. Nikola Tesla arrived in New York in 1884, 28 years old, with a letter of recommendation from a supervisor in the Paris office of Edison's European operations. The letter reportedly said, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Tesla was brilliant in a way that was almost unsettling. He had a photographic memory, could visualize complex machines entirely in his mind before building them, and had already developed ideas about alternating current that he believed could transform electrical power. He was also, unlike Edison, a formally trained engineer with deep theoretical knowledge. Edison put him to work immediately. For about a year, Tesla redesigned Edison's DC generators, improved their efficiency dramatically, and by most accounts outperformed everyone else in the lab. Edison, according to Tesla's own later account, had promised a reward of $50,000 if Tesla could fix the machines to Edison's satisfaction. Tesla worked around the clock for months. He delivered, then he asked for the money. Edison told him it was a joke, an American joke, he said. He offered Tesla a $10 a week raise instead. Tesla quit the same day. He was furious and humiliated. For a period after leaving, he couldn't find work as an engineer and was reportedly reduced to digging ditches to survive. The Wizard of Menlo Park had driven one of the greatest engineering minds in history to manual labor. It was the most expensive mistake Edison ever made. Tesla eventually found investors, developed his AC motor, and licensed his patents to industrialist George Westinghouse, Edison's chief competitor. And that's when the war began. The technical difference was straightforward. Edison's direct current could only travel about a mile from its source before losing power. You needed a generator every mile or two to run a city. which made the system enormously expensive to scale. Tesla's alternating current, on the other hand, could be stepped up to high voltages and transmitted across hundreds of miles, then stepped back down for safe household use. It was technically superior in almost every way for large-scale power distribution. Edison knew this. He also knew that his entire business empire was built on DC. He had hundreds of patents, dozens of companies, and enormous investments all tied to the direct current system. Losing the current war wasn't just a technical defeat, it was financial ruin. So he did something that didn't fit the image of the heroic inventor at all. He launched a propaganda campaign. Edison's team began publicly electrocuting animals, dogs, calves, horses, using Westinghouse's alternating current equipment in demonstrations designed to prove that AC was lethally dangerous. They coined the term Westinghoused as slang for death by electrocution. When New York State began searching for a more humane method of executing prisoners than hanging, Edison, a man who had publicly opposed capital punishment, recommended AC-powered electrocution as the deadliest option, specifically to link alternating current in the public mind with death. The first electric chair, built by an engineer secretly on Edison's payroll, was powered by a Westinghouse AC generator. On August 6, 1890, it was used for the first time on a convicted murderer named William Kemmler. But the propaganda didn't work. In 1893, the organizers of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, one of the most attended events in American history, put the contract to electrify the entire fair out to bid. General Electric, the company formed from Edison's operations, bid $554 using DC. Westinghouse bid $399 using Tesla's AC. Westinghouse won. Millions of people visited that fair and walked through a city powered entirely by alternating current. 3 years later, Westinghouse won the contract to build the generators at Niagara Falls. On November 16, 1896, electricity from Niagara Falls reached the city of Buffalo, New York, 26 miles away. It was the moment that settled the question permanently. AC had won. The war of currents was over. Edison had lost. And in the process, he had been stripped of control of his own company, which merged with competitors in 1890 to form General Electric, a corporation that still exists today, and that operates largely without Edison's name on it. The Wizard of Menlo Park had been outmaneuvered, but what happened next surprised everyone, including the people who thought they had beaten him. Most men, after losing what Edison lost, would have retreated, retired, accepted the legacy, and lived off the reputation. Edison did the opposite. He disappeared into one of the most ambitious and most disastrous of projects of his career. In the early 1890s, convinced he could revolutionize the American iron and steel industry, Edison bought 19,000 acres of land in the hills of northwestern New Jersey and began building what he called a magnetic ore separation plant. The idea was to extract iron from low-grade rock deposits that conventional mining had abandoned, using powerful electromagnets to pull pure iron from crushed stone. He built what was at the time one of the largest ore-crushing mills in the world. He moved there, worked around the clock, and barely came home for years. To fund the operation, he sold all of his stock in General Electric. The iron ore project consumed a decade of his life and nearly his entire fortune. The technology worked, the engineering was genuinely innovative, and would later influence industries Edison never intended. But the economics were lethal. Just as Edison's New Jersey plant was reaching full production, massive deposits of high-grade iron ore were discovered in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. The Minnesota ore cost $3 a ton to mine. Edison's cost $7. He couldn't compete. In 1899, he shut it down. He had spent over $2 million of his own dollars. The General Electric stock he had sold to fund the venture was by then worth $4 million. His response, which has been recorded, was, "Well, it's all gone, but we had a hell of a good time spending it." That line reveals something essential about Edison that his mythology often obscures. He wasn't a man who crumbled. He was a man who absorbed catastrophic failure and kept moving. The same machinery he developed for the ore project was adapted to produce Portland cement, and Edison's cement company became profitable enough to help rebuild his finances. Edison's cement was eventually used in the construction of Yankee Stadium. He kept inventing a nickel-iron storage battery that he believed would one day power electric automobiles, decades before the rest of the world took the idea seriously. An improved phonograph, advances in motion picture technology, including early experiments synchronizing film with recorded sound, a concept that the film industry wouldn't fully realize for another 30 years. He filed patents into his 70s and 80s on topics ranging from electric trains to synthetic rubber made from goldenrod plants he grew in his garden in Fort Myers, Florida. In Fort Myers, two of the most unexpected friends in American history spent their winters together. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, the man who had once been a young engineer at one of Edison's illuminating companies, who had shown Edison a sketch of a gasoline-powered car at a company party in 1896, and whom Edison had encouraged with the words, "Young man, that's the thing." Now, decades later, the two men who had each transformed the world lived as neighbors in Florida, racing each other in wheelchairs down the path between their estates. Ford had idolized Edison since before they met, and while Edison lost his own corporate battles, he had unknowingly launched the career of the man who would build one of the most powerful companies in the world. Legacy, it turns out, isn't always the thing you build. Sometimes it's the thing you inspire. By the late 1920s, Thomas Edison was in his 80s. He was using a wheelchair. His diabetes had worsened, and the relentless pace of a lifetime spent sleeping 4 hours a night had taken its toll. But the world had not forgotten him. On October 20, 1928, the United States Congress awarded Edison the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the nation can bestow. President Herbert Hoover presented it personally. Then, in 1929, the country organized what they called Light's Golden Jubilee, a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the incandescent light bulb. The event was held in Dearborn, Michigan, at the museum Henry Ford had named in Edison's honor. Ford had gone so far as to physically reconstruct Edison's original Menlo Park laboratory on the museum grounds, transporting the soil from New Jersey because he believed the ground itself deserved to be preserved. Albert Einstein attended. President Hoover attended. Henry Ford sat beside his oldest friend. Edison, frail but present, recreated the moment from 50 years earlier, connecting a filament, pumping out the air from a glass bulb, and letting it glow for the crowd. When the light came on, the room was silent. 2 years later, on October 18, 1931, Thomas Alva Edison, died at his home in West Orange, New Jersey. He was 84 years old. In the bedroom where he died, his son Charles noticed a rack of empty glass test tubes sitting open on the table. They were from Edison's own laboratory at West Orange, the chemical room where he had spent decades working. Charles asked the attending doctor to seal them with paraffin wax. He later sent one of the sealed tubes to Henry Ford as a memorial gift. That tube, containing the air from the room where Edison drew his final breath, sits today in a display case at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. It is, depending on how you look at it, either one of the strangest relics in American history or one of the most poetic. A man whose entire life was about capturing things, sounds, light, images, electricity, preserved in glass. One last time. After Edison's death, a proposal was made to dim the electric lights across the United States for 1 minute as a tribute. They decided ultimately not to do it. Not because the gesture wasn't deserved, but because by 1931, the grid that Edison had built was so essential to hospitals, to infrastructure, to the millions of machines running on electricity across the country, that turning it off, even for 60 seconds, was no longer possible. The system had outgrown the man who built it, and maybe that's the most honest summary of Thomas Alva Edison there is. He was brilliant and ruthless and obsessive and deeply, painfully human. He was wrong about the war of currents and right about almost everything else. He stole credit and gave it away in the same decade. He neglected his family and cherished his friendships. He failed spectacularly and recovered without self-pity. He treated invention not as art, but as work, relentless, systematic, unglamorous work. And in doing so, he produced more of it than any single person in recorded history. 1,983 patents. A phonograph that taught the world its own voice back to itself. A light bulb that made night optional. A power station that became the blueprint for every grid on Earth. A motion picture system that gave birth to Hollywood. A storage battery that still informs the design of modern electric vehicles more than a century later. The boy who was called addled. The telegraph operator who slept in offices. The man who stood alone in a dark lab holding a glowing bulb and didn't smile because he already knew. Thomas Edison didn't just invent things. He invented the modern world's relationship with invention. The idea that discovery is not a gift from above, but a product of stubbornness, process, and refusal to stop. The light is still on.